Imagine a perfectly ordinary Friday. A paycheck lands in the checking account. Nothing dramatic happens. There's no new television, no vacation booking, no designer bag showing up at the door. Instead, the electric bill clears. The car needs gas. Someone stops at the grocery store. Childcare is due. A prescription gets picked up. And somewhere between Friday and the next payday, the checking account gets too close to zero. So the credit card comes out. Not because somebody wanted something exciting, because Tuesday still had to happen. That distinction matters because one of the biggest stories in American credit card debt right now isn't luxury spending. It's ordinary life. Bankrate's 2026 survey found that 33% of people carrying credit card debt said day-to-day expenses such as groceries, childcare, and utilities were the primary reason for that debt. That number was 26% in 2023, then 28%. Now it's 1 in 3. To be precise, that does not mean researchers traced exactly 1/3 of every dollar of American credit card debt back to household bills. It means 1/3 of the people already carrying this debt say everyday expenses are the main reason they got there, and that may be even more revealing. Because retail purchases like clothing and electronics were the primary reason for only 10%. Vacation and entertainment, 7%. The stereotype says credit card debt begins when people buy too much stuff. The reality is increasingly less dramatic. Sometimes the balance begins with milk, gasoline, electricity, and Tuesday. And once normal life starts landing on a revolving credit line, something changes. A credit card stops being only a payment method. It starts behaving like a second paycheck, except this paycheck has to be paid back with interest. Consider what happens when someone buys $150 of groceries with a credit card and pays the card in full when the statement arrives. Financially, the card mostly acted as a temporary payment rail. The groceries were consumed, the bill was paid, the transaction is finished. Now change one detail. The same $150 goes on the card, but when the statement arrives, there isn't enough cash to pay the full balance. Part of that grocery trip survives into next month. The food may already be gone. The debt isn't, and next month still has groceries. That is the mechanism underneath this entire story. Recurring expenses meet revolving debt. The expense repeats. The old balance remains. Then the new expense gets stacked on top of it. CNBC and SurveyMonkey found in April 2026 that 39% of Americans used a credit card for groceries or household essentials because of affordability concerns. 31% had used cards for transportation costs, 21% for utilities, 20% for medical expenses. These aren't categories people can simply postpone forever. You can delay a television. The electric bill is less flexible. You can skip a vacation. You still have to get to work. And people can switch grocery brands, buy fewer extras, or hunt for cheaper stores. But eventually, there is a floor underneath how little a household can spend while continuing to function. That's why the credit card can feel so useful at first. It solves a timing problem immediately. The refrigerator is empty today. Payday is next Friday. The card makes those two dates temporarily compatible. Swipe now, handle it later. If later comes with enough money, the system works. But when later arrives with another rent payment, another utility bill, another grocery trip, and another tank of gas, the temporary bridge can become permanent. Suppose a household is consistently short by $300 a month, not $300 of vacations. Just a $300 gap between income and ordinary expenses. 1 month, the card absorbs $300, then another $300, then another. After 6 months, that's $1,800 of new principal before even considering interest. Nothing spectacular had to happen. No single purchase explains the balance. That is what makes this kind of debt so easy to misunderstand. People often look at a $5,000 credit card balance. And imagine there must have been a $5,000 mistake. There may not have been. It can be 50 small shortages, one grocery trip, one utility bill, one repair, 3 tanks of gas, another grocery trip, a prescription. A week when childcare and the electric bill hit before payday. The balance can grow without ever producing one memorable object that feels worth $5,000. And interest changes the math once that balance starts surviving from one statement to the next. Federal Reserve data released in August 2026 showed that commercial bank credit card accounts actually being assessed interest carried an average rate of about 22%. At that rate, carrying debt is expensive, but interest is only half the problem. The more important change happens to the next paycheck. Imagine someone earns enough next month to cover next month's normal expenses. That sounds like the problem is solved. Except now, part of that income is already spoken for. There's a minimum payment, there's interest, there's old spending sitting on the statement. So money that could have paid this month's groceries is now paying for last month's groceries. That creates a strange financial overlap. The household is living in August, but part of the August paycheck is still funding July, and September is coming anyway. This is where a credit card balance stops looking like a record of past spending and starts becoming a claim on future income. That difference is huge, because the obvious explanation for this story is simply that everyday life became more expensive, and there is truth in that. In the CNBC and SurveyMonkey survey, 56% of Americans said everyday life had become less affordable for their household compared with a year earlier. Groceries were the most commonly cited pressure. Transportation came next, then utilities, healthcare, insurance, and housing. People responded in predictable ways. They cut discretionary spending. Some dipped into savings. Some looked for more work. Some put necessary expenses on credit. But higher prices alone don't explain why a temporary credit card charge turns into long-term debt. For that, you have to look at margin. The difference between what comes in and what absolutely has to go out. A household can have a decent income and still have very little margin after housing, food, transportation, insurance, childcare, and other recurring obligations. If that household has $500 left after the essentials, a $200 surprise is annoying. If it has $40 left, the same surprise changes the month. And when the margin is already negative, the credit card does something psychologically powerful. It hides the brake, the lights stay on, the groceries still leave the store, the car still gets fuel. From the outside, the household continues to look normal. The shortage moves somewhere less visible, onto a balance. That's why "just stop using the card" can describe the symptom without explaining the mechanism. If someone is charging restaurant meals, they could comfortably stop buying. Removing the card may immediately reduce spending. But if the charge is an electric bill and the checking account is $120 short, cutting up the card doesn't manufacture another $120. It simply exposes the shortage sooner. The card did not create the original gap, it financed it. That distinction doesn't make the debt harmless. It makes the trap easier to understand, because once a recurring cash flow shortage is financed, the financing itself becomes another recurring expense. Interest, minimum payments, less available credit, less available cash, less room for the next surprise. The original problem was, how do I cover this month? A few balances later, the question becomes, how do I cover this month while also paying for the months that already happened? That is a different financial state, and it helps explain why credit card debt can persist for so long. Bankrate found that 61% of people with credit card debt had been carrying debt for at least a year. 31% had been carrying it for at least 3 years. 21% said 5 years or longer. That doesn't look like a one-time shopping spree. It looks like a balance becoming part of the household budget. The monthly card payment joins rent, insurance, the car, utilities, childcare. Except, unlike many of those bills, the card payment may represent dozens of old expenses compressed into one new obligation. This is the second transformation. First, basic bills become credit card charges. Then credit card debt itself becomes a basic bill, and that creates a feedback loop. Less cash is available because the card needs to be paid. So more current expenses may go onto the card, which makes the future payment larger, which leaves less cash later. Not every household in credit card debt is in that cycle, and not every person who uses a card for groceries is borrowing. Millions of Americans use credit cards for ordinary purchases and pay the statement in full. For them, rewards, fraud protection, and convenience can make cards useful tools. The financial state changes only when the balance survives. That distinction is important. Credit card usage is not the same thing as credit card debt. But nationally, the amount sitting on credit card accounts is enormous. The New York Federal Reserve reported that balances reached about $1.26 trillion in the second quarter of 2026. That number by itself doesn't tell us what everyone bought. It doesn't tell us which part is groceries, which part is travel, or which part will be paid off before meaningful interest accumulates. What it does show is the scale of the credit system sitting underneath American household spending, and the surveys tell us something about the people inside that number. For a growing share of debtors, everyday expenses are no longer merely passing through the card. They're staying there. That is much more important than whether Americans are technically using cards more. The deeper question is what the card is being asked to do. Is it replacing cash for convenience or replacing cash that isn't there? Those can look identical at checkout. Same card, same terminal, same bag of groceries, completely different household balance sheet. One person taps the card, knowing the full statement will disappear next month. Another taps the same card knowing they can probably make the minimum. The purchase looks identical, the future does not. And that difference explains why minimum payments can create such a misleading sense of stability. A minimum payment tells you how little you are required to send the lender this month. It does not tell you whether your underlying monthly budget works. Someone can make every minimum payment on time while their balance continues to absorb the gap between earnings and essential expenses. The account can technically remain current while the household becomes less flexible. That lost flexibility may be the most expensive part, because debt competes with everything the household wants to do next. Build emergency savings, replace a failing car, move, handle a medical bill. Take time off, fix the roof, even absorb another expensive grocery month. Bankrate found that almost 2/3 of credit card debtors had delayed or avoided financial decisions because of their debt. That is the consequence that doesn't appear on the supermarket receipt. A purchase made to solve today's problem can narrow tomorrow's options. Again, the problem isn't that somebody bought food. Food was never the mystery. The mystery is what happens when ordinary recurring life costs more than the cash available to pay for it, and revolving credit quietly absorbs the difference. For a while, very little appears to change. The household keeps functioning, then the balance becomes larger. Interest takes a bigger bite. The minimum payment grows. Future income has less room, and eventually, the card that originally created flexibility begins removing it. That's why the statistic about everyday expenses matters. In 2023, 26% of credit card debtors told Bankrate that day-to-day expenses were the main reason for their debt. By 2026, it was 33%. At the same time, only 10% pointed primarily to retail purchases such as clothing or electronics. 7% pointed to vacations and entertainment. The story many people imagine is still about buying things you shouldn't have bought. But the more uncomfortable story is about financing things you were going to buy anyway: the electric bill, the fuel, the childcare, the groceries. A credit card can make all of those expenses disappear from checking today. It cannot make the cost disappear. It moves the cost through time. And when income never catches back up, time becomes the trap. The clearest way to understand this isn't to stare at a national trillion-dollar balance. Look at one ordinary receipt. The groceries are already eaten. The gas is already burned. The electricity was already used. The childcare already happened. But part of the bill may still be sitting on a credit card statement months later, and meanwhile, all four expenses have arrived again. That is what it means when everyday life starts becoming revolving debt. You're no longer only paying for the life you're living now. Part of today's paycheck is paying for a life you already lived, and that may be the real warning inside that 1/3 number.